This is World History of Christianity, Chapter 12, Part 1. Christianity in Western Europe from the Enlightenment. Mary Hyman. Introduction. At some point between the late 17th century and the present day, there occurred an important shift in the way in which the Christian message was viewed by most Western Europeans. The most succinct way of expressing the contrast between the general attitude of mind of the 1690s and that of the 1990s would be to say that in the late 17th century, Christianity was generally presumed to be true unless there seemed good reasons to doubt, whereas in the late 20th century, Christianity was usually presumed to be untrue unless good reasons could be given to believe. Exactly how and when the burden of proof shifted from the non-Christian to the Christian position is not the sort of question which can be answered precisely, let alone authoritatively, by any historian. But it is probably the question which is most central to understanding the post-Enlightenment period in the West. Every historical period has its own prejudices and universified assumptions, uncritically held beliefs, which together make up what one historian has aptly termed the climate of opinion. Since our own period is no exception to this rule, any account which we offer of the past is bound to be partial, to betray modern concerns and beliefs at least as much as it reflects those of earlier times. To this fundamental problem, which is rooted in the nature of historical writing, there does not seem to be any satisfactory solution. The best that can be hoped is that the inevitable distortion will be minimized through a deliberate attempt to follow the lead of contemporary sources in order to recapture distinctive attitudes as they were expressed in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The intention is to discuss the issues in a way which focuses primarily on the intellectual, rather than the political, institutional, or even sociological aspects of Christianity. The reader whose interests lie in the relationship between religion and social class, or in the political behavior of the institutional churches, will find many excellent surveys to complement or to replace the present study. The aim here will be to place religious beliefs at the center of discussion. Enlightenment. At the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century, the religious map of Western Europe was more or less the same as it is today. France, Poland, Spain, Portugal, and the territories, which are now called Belgium, Italy, Austria, and Hungary, were Catholic by majority. Britain, the Scandinavian countries, and much of Switzerland were Protestant. The German states were roughly divided between a Protestant north and a Catholic south, and the Dutch Republic, although officially Protestant, was similarly split. The post-Reformation division of what had once been Christendom into two mutually suspicious and antagonistic ideological blocs is so familiar that we may easily forget how unnatural religious disunity seemed to Europeans at the time. Neither the Protestant nor the Catholic side believed that truth was divisible, or that religious differences among Europeans were anything less than a scandal. For nearly 2 centuries after Martin Luther's new interpretation of faith had caught the imagination of Christians throughout Europe, civil and international wars of religion, interspersed with periods of Cold War and detente, had been the ordinary state of affairs in Europe as each side tried to impose religious hegemony throughout the continent. It was only in 1648 that what might be seen as the last full-blown war of religion between European states, the 30 Years' War, was concluded by the Peace of Westphalia. Memories of the dream of a unified Christian West lingered on in official documents well beyond that date. The Treaty of Utrecht of 1713 still described the geographical area, afterwards known only as Europe, as Christendom. The Holy Roman Empire staggered on until its eventual abolition by Napoleon I in 1806. But from the late 17th century, and certainly by the opening years of the 18th, it seemed clear to most Europeans that a stalemate in the wars of religion had been reached. The notion that Protestantism might be obliterated no longer seemed tenable, and it did not appear plausible that Catholic countries would reform themselves in a Protestant direction. The problem of whether religious integrity within national borders could be achieved remained a more open question. All Western European governments appeared to feel, at least at times, that this would be both a desirable and a possible end, and took measures designed to further it. In order to accord special status to a single denomination, which was understood to represent the nation's religion, governments chose to approve and uphold a single established church, whose functions were mingled to a greater or lesser degree with those of the government. The timing and details of establishment, which depended partly on the historical background of church-state relations, varied from country to country. So did the degree of toleration which it seemed right or expedient to accord to those who fell outside the umbrella of the established faith. The division of Europe into states associated with a single Christian denomination made good political sense in the aftermath of the 16th and 17th century wars of religion. In the longer term, the policy created new problems, particularly those of how religious minorities ought to be accommodated and how far governments should intervene in matters of religion. The very fact that irreconcilable divisions of opinion existed in a realm of thought as fundamental as religious belief and practice posed difficulties for faith. A good deal of the history of Christianity in Europe from the Enlightenment onwards was taken up with these social, political, and intellectual problems whose tone and detail varied over time, but whose difficulties could all be traced back to the breakup of what had once been Christendom. It is now a long-standing convention to use the expression the Enlightenment to describe the climate of Western opinion, intellectual, political, and religious, which dominated Europe from the end of the 17th century until the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. Like all such historical abstractions, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and others, the term encourages one particular perspective to be applied to what is seen as a discrete period of history. It seems entirely appropriate that it should have been Immanuel Kant who in 1793 first coined the phrase Aufklärung, translated as Enlightenment in English and Lumières in French, to describe the European state of mind of the previous 100 years. The term carries with it a number of unspoken assumptions, which one might expect a philosopher who was also a Protestant, a Prussian, and a member of an educated and cultured elite to have taken as axiomatic. Embedded in the term Enlightenment, as in its common alternative, the Age of Reason, lie a number of hidden assumptions both about how history ought to be approached and about the distinctive features of the 18th century in the history of Western Europe. Among these are the beliefs that developments in philosophy are of the utmost significance, that those whose frame of mind was affected by such developments, mainly the well-to-do and educated, are the people whose outlook ought to be taken to characterize a particular culture, and that the Western world was in the vanguard of human thought at this particular time. Over the course of the 20th century, each of these assumptions has been tacitly called into question. One of the legacies of Marxist approaches to history has been to challenge the notion that elites may be taken as typical of any given historical period. Were one to ignore the upper echelons of 18th century society and focus instead on its peasants, artisans, and laborers, one might indeed find that enlightenment seems less appropriate an appellation than some other term which would imply continuity rather than a sudden break with the past. An analogous problem is presented by the notion that the thought of whole peoples can be described in terms of intellectual progress, or indeed that there exists such a thing as intellectual progress at all. The dangers of the so-called Whiggish approach to history, of the historian's tendency to select and interpret evidence in ways which emphasize certain principles of progress in the past in order to produce a story which is the ratification, if not the glorification, of the present, were first put forward by the historian Herbert Butterfield in 1931. More recently, they have found an emphatic endorsement in the arguments of postmodernist critics that no historical writing can really be disinterested, and that value judgments about the past reveal little more than present-day prejudices. There are at least two compelling reasons why the familiar account of the 18th century as the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason should put us on our guard. The first is that we have a vested interest in believing in it. All that we consider most modern and progressive in Western society is generally agreed to owe its origins to the enlightened thought of the 18th century philosophers, political democracy, and the possibility of advancement through merit, the achievements of science and technology, and the freedom of individual conscience from the tyrannies of any single religion or other state-imposed ideology. There is a second reason why we should exercise caution in accepting the common view that the 18th century heralded the dawn of progress, humane values, and intellectual enlightenment in the West. The idea has not come to us from impartial witnesses, but rather from crusaders or propagandists of the time who called themselves philosophers. Aufklärer, philosophes, the enlightened ones. These self-appointed intellectual elites of the 18th century were self-publicists as well as critics of the status quo. Denouncing religious intolerance, the implication seemed to be that they alone were tolerant, reiterating that experience and reason were their sole guides to thought. They vilified their opponents as prejudiced and irrational, presenting themselves as the intellectual equals of the ancient Greeks. They proclaimed that they offered the sure and universal method for discovering certain truths. Their method, induction, was not new. Its origins could be traced back to Aristotle, but developments in natural philosophy, what would today be called science, which had occurred during the 17th century, appeared to give the empirical method new validity. It would be misleading to regard the natural philosophers whose names are associated with the scientific revolution of the 17th century, Newton, Kepler, Halley, Harvey, Galileo, Robert Boyle, and others, as scientists in the modern sense, still less as technocrats. Nor would it be wise to separate their philosophies from their discoveries, or more accurately, theories about aspects of the natural world. Yet it was the claims of these natural philosophers to be able to describe mechanisms believed to operate in the real world, and not only to make logical sense within the covers of philosophical treatises, which particularly excited their 18th century descendants. The self-consciously enlightened thinkers of the 18th century made heroes of the 17th century natural philosophers. According to their accounts, methods of inquiry as propounded by Francis Bacon in his Proficience and Advancement of Learning, 1605, Novum Organum, 1620, De Augmentis Scientiarum, 1623, as well as in his better-known essays, and developed in 17th century works of physics, chemistry, and astronomy had led to the discovery of universally valid natural laws. Galileo's law of dynamics and new theory of the solar system, Kepler's laws of planetary motions, Boyle's laws about the properties of gases, all of these theories were regarded as the fruits of rational inquiry, which added to the sum of objective human knowledge about the workings of nature. All seemed likely to lead both to further theoretical insights and, in that favorite 18th century phrase, to the development and diffusion of useful knowledge. The supposed heroism of the great men of the 17th century did not, however, rest solely on the quality of their scientific contributions. Their credibility in 18th century eyes stemmed just as much from their advocacy of particular kinds of theology which, being described as natural or reasonable, could be contrasted with the supposed irrationality and arbitrariness of forms of religion associated with absolutist and backward European states. Wishing to criticize what were seen as corruptions in the traditional pillars of society, monarchy, aristocracy, and the church, while at the same time upholding Christian ethics, most philosophers were far from socially radical. Only those 17th century natural philosophers who had clearly and explicitly defended traditional morality were safe from public opprobrium for most of the 18th century. Among those who were omitted from the pantheon of the enlightened were Baruch Spinoza, whose denial of miracles and of the reality of evil had put him beyond the pale of respectable philosophy from the end of the 17th century. Thomas Hobbes and Nicholas Malebranche, who were considered to hold dangerously equivocal stances on morality as well as serious errors in theology. Natural philosophers who had steered away from controversial religious subjects were likely to fare much better. Boyle's law did indeed appear from an 18th century perspective to represent an increase in knowledge which would no doubt lead to useful applications. But his insistence that scientific truth was in perfect harmony with a rational view of Christianity was every bit as important in raising him to the status of an enlightened predecessor. Galileo's merit as an astronomer was certainly an important factor in his rise to fame, but his heroism was chiefly seen in what was presented as his martyrdom to truth. It was because his investigations into the working of the solar system were pursued even when he was accused of heresy by a bigoted Catholic Church that the Enlightenment gave him their highest accolade of a true philosopher. In taking upon themselves the title of philosopher while quietly dropping the qualifier of natural, the self-consciously enlightened of the 18th century did more than pay their respects to the likes of Boyle and Galileo. They also claimed to be their intellectual heirs, choosing to see themselves as martyrs to truth who fearlessly applied objective and rational methods of inquiry to the metaphysical realm as their heroes had to the physical world. Of all the intellectual giants who found a place in the 18th century pantheon of true philosophers, Isaac Newton was undoubtedly the most acclaimed. Only perhaps his fellow countryman, the philosopher John Locke, came as close to universal esteem and admiration. The words composed by Alexander Pope in 1730 for Newton's epitaph in Westminster Abbey offered a simple tribute, as if further explanation could only detract from the greatness of the man. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. Among the international set of intellectuals who called themselves philosophers, Newton and Locke were as widely acclaimed abroad as they were at home. Just as England's constitutional government was favorably contrasted with arbitrary rule elsewhere, so the new philosophy, which coincided with England's glorious revolution of 1688, was held up as an example first in France, and then among self-consciously advanced thinkers throughout the Western world. At first glance, Newton's overwhelming importance to the 18th century critics, wits, writers, and dabblers in science who adopted the name of philosopher may seem puzzling. That a physicist should have become a household name, even among cultured people, is surprising, especially since the most celebrated of Newton's works, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, 1687, was incomprehensible to those without mathematical training. Ironically enough, this fact probably helped rather than hindered his rise to fame. It meant that would-be philosophers had to rely on second-hand accounts of the Principia Mathematica, such as that offered by François-Marie Arouet, better known by his pseudonym Voltaire. In his far more accessible and engaging Lettres philosophiques or Lettres sur les Anglais, philosophical letters or letters on the English of 1733, which were eagerly read in coffee houses, salons, and drawing rooms throughout continental Europe and its colonies in the New World. As explicated and popularized by Voltaire and other philosophies, Newton seemed to teach a number of valuable lessons, most of which were only tangentially concerned with physics. First of all, the Principia showed that logical sense could be made of a variety of apparently disconnected phenomena, and that the symbolic language of mathematics could account for aspects of reality as diverse as orbiting spheres and falling apples. To the philosophers, this seemed to prove that universal laws were not paper fictions, but the key to all knowledge, providing insights into humanity as well as understandings of the natural world. Newton's work was also seen to demonstrate that the new philosophy, which was grounded firmly in a rational belief in God, supported what tended to be called the essentials of Christianity, although arguments were later to emerge over precisely which aspects of Christianity were central and which peripheral. The methods which Newton was thought to have used in the realm of physics were endorsed by John Locke in the branch of philosophy known as epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. In his An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1690, just 3 years after Newton's Principia Mathematica, Locke argued that all human beings were born in a state of ignorance, their minds as empty of ideas as a clean slate or blank page. By living in the world, they accumulated experiences, at first only simple sensory experiences such as feeling hot or cold or perceiving softness or hardness. Through their innate ability to reason, these merely animal sensations were abstracted into simple ideas such as solidity, cold, or whiteness. From such simple ideas, more complex ideas were developed, including, according to Locke, the concept of number, the notion of the immaterial soul, and the existence of God, all of which his essay claimed to have proved. All human knowledge, including knowledge of God and of the supernatural dimension of life, therefore, was argued to be demonstrable through experience of the world as filtered through mental reflection. Locke's highly influential argument managed to accommodate the earlier philosopher Descartes' insistence upon the intellectual necessity of applying systematic doubt to common sense truths, while at the same time refuting the notion that innate ideas existed in the mind. It thus opened up the possibility of applying the empirical methods advocated by natural philosophers like Francis Bacon to the sphere of all philosophical speculation. To the enlightened, this seemed to show that inductive reasoning could conclusively establish the independent existence of the world and begin to unravel its mechanisms. It also seemed to prove the objective reality of both God and the soul, while at the same time endorsing the methods and findings of modern philosophical or scientific thought. Small wonder that Locke and Newton were accorded a special niche in the 18th century Temple of Fame, or that philosophers who saw themselves as their disciples felt confident that their new methods of reasoning would eventually lead to the establishment of a rationally ordered world, a utopia in which ignorance would be banished, virtue flourish, and enlightenment spread to all corners of the still darkened world. Rational religion. The history of Christianity in Western Europe from the Enlightenment is often presented as a story of steady and inevitable decline. This view presupposes at least two highly dubious assumptions. Firstly, it takes for granted that the Middle Ages represented an age of faith, in which everyone believed wholeheartedly in Orthodox Christianity as preached by the Catholic Church. This assumption hardly seems to be borne out by the recurrence of doctrinal disputes and heretical movements throughout the Middle Ages and by the later emergence of Protestantism, a reformist movement important enough to tear European society apart for most of the 16th and 17th centuries. The second assumption, which underlies deterministic views of the decline of religion, is that forces loosely described as progress, rationality, and the rise of science ushered in a revolution in European thought, which inevitably, if gradually, overwhelmed the heritage of Christian teaching and its expression in Christian society. At their crudest, such accounts imply that the Christian view of the world, being false, could not help but admit defeat in the face of the inexorable advance of scientific and secular truth. There are a number of problems with this view, not least that the long-predicted secularization of Europe has yet to have occurred in any unambiguous way. The signs of advancing atheism, which seemed so clear to liberals of the 1960s and 1970s, seem far less certain in the 1990s. As for the notion that widespread loss of faith was caused by the rise of science, it is just as easy to take the opposite view, arguing that the new scientific thinking of the Enlightenment period rose to prominence precisely because it appeared to contemporaries to offer irrefutable proofs of what were held to be the central truths of Christianity. In our own age, which tends to treat religion and science as belonging in separate compartments, it is perhaps difficult to imagine how they could ever have been subsumed in the same branch of study. For most of the history of Western Europe, however, science, which meant nothing more than what would now be called systematic knowledge, comprised numerous branches. These included logic and mathematics, the study of the physical world, and intellectual speculations, which would today be divided firmly into the philosophical and the theological. Since truth was the object of all knowledge and truth was indivisible, all of these branches of knowledge were held to complement each other. Mathematical formulae presupposed a divine origin, just as the existence of a rational creator presupposed the truth of mathematical logic. Natural philosophers looked for ordered patterns in the world, but the discovery of such patterns could only be understood as endorsements of the fact of creation and the rationality of the creator. Evidences of God's existence and attributes were traditionally divided into the natural and the supernatural. The natural were those which were held to be open to rational inquiry, to the application of human reason to observed phenomena in the world. Supernatural evidences were those which came in the shape of revealed knowledge, principally through that revelation which was delivered in the Scriptures, but also through the continued operation of the Holy Spirit, as safeguarded in church doctrine and traditions. Protestants tended to emphasize the Bible as the prime source of spiritual knowledge, and Catholics to give more stress to the tradition of the Church, but neither side, for all its posturings, could dispense altogether with either historical or scriptural evidence. Rational proofs for the existence of God had, of course, been put forward by theologians and scholastics throughout the Middle Ages. There was nothing new in the simple fact of their existence in the 17th and 18th centuries. But in a Europe which had suffered over a century of religious warfare and was still torn by deep religious divisions, there were new reasons why intellectual proofs which claimed to argue from first principles and to rely on reason alone for their persuasiveness were much more likely to find a popular audience in the period which has come to be known as the Enlightenment. Although differences between Catholic and Protestant justifications for religious knowledge can be seen as differences of degree rather than of kind, arguments over the relative importance of the Bible and Christian tradition from the Reformation onwards had caused and continued to cause much bitterness and mutual misunderstanding. Armed with the inductive methods of the natural sciences, the 18th century philosophers declared themselves to have certain grounds for knowledge of the essentials of Christianity. A large part of their intellectual mission, as they saw it, was to purge the Christian faith of its irrational accretions, those stubbornly held beliefs and practices which had divided Catholics from Protestants and had led to what were disparaged as enthusiasm, meaning fanaticism, bigotry, and intolerance. Although this missionary zeal could, and often did, lead to anti-clericalism, the hatred of the irrational aspects of both Protestant and especially Catholic belief, and to contempt for a good deal of the legacy of the Middle Ages, it was not intended to undermine belief in what were seen as the fundamentals of the Christian message. Far from hoping to debunk what they saw as true faith, the philosophers set out to defend it with the most up-to-date intellectual materials. They did so in the sanguine belief that their interpretation, since it was held to be accessible to reasonable men and women of all backgrounds, Catholic or Protestant, was innately uncontroversial as well as demonstrably true. When Locke wrote his essay concerning human understanding, he did not feel it necessary to dwell too long on proofs for the existence of God, since God's existence seemed to him to be the most obvious truth that reason discovers. Newton's physics, too, was firmly predicated on the belief in a divine creator, one very well skilled in mechanics and geometry. To those whose view of the universe was an increasingly mechanical one, the evidence that an intelligent mind must have created it seemed almost too obvious to be worth stating. Here, if anywhere, was a point upon which all rational people might agree. As even the notorious infidel Voltaire marveled, contemplating the starry night sky, one would have to be blind not to be dazzled by this sight. One would have to be stupid not to recognize its author. One would have to be mad not to worship him. The more certain and detailed knowledge of the world was thought to be, and the more rational in its workings, the less plausible it seemed to maintain that it could have come about by any means other than the deliberate creation of a supreme intelligence. Boyle summed up the general appeal to common sense by asking rhetorically how so curious an engine as this world could possibly have been produced by a casual concurrence of the parts it consists of. The very intricacy of the workings of the universe seemed to reveal its creation by a deliberate divine act. The beauty of enlightened or rational Christianity was that its tenets were thought to be as self-evidently true as geometrical proofs or the laws of physics. God's existence and his purposes for creation could, it claimed, be established beyond the shadow of a doubt or the possibility of dispute. But such proofs, however elegantly and persuasively stated, did not go beyond the first premises of traditional Christianity. They therefore offered an implicit, if unintended, invitation to reductionism, since it is only a small step from the belief that the existence of a divine creator can be proved to the position that only those tenets which can be logically proved are true. Locke had insisted in his Letters Concerning Toleration of 1689, 1690, and 1692 that all religions, except those whose dogmatism made them intolerant of others, ought to be allowed to exist unmolested. Similarly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had reason to mistrust religious dogmatism through his own experience of converting from Calvinism to Catholicism and back again, argued in his Du Contrat Social, The Social Contract, 1762, that a perfect state would uphold natural religion but forbid all creeds which refused to tolerate the others. Voltaire, fulminating against sectarianism in his Philosophical Dictionary, pointed out that there are no sects in geometry. We don't say an Euclidean and Archimedean. When the truth is evident, it is impossible for parties and factions to arise. People have never argued over whether it was daytime at noon. In seeking to find a version of Christianity as self-evident as its being daytime at noon, the enlightened philosophers were certainly optimistic. They were also liable to stir up precisely the sort of controversy which they sought to avoid, since their arguments could not conclusively prove the validity of the tenets either of traditional Catholicism or of Orthodox Protestantism, but at best only a lowest common denominator, ultimately unsatisfactory to both sides. The most minimalist interpretations of Christianity, which arose out of attempts to establish a rational basis for faith, have traditionally been classified under the umbrella term deism. In his A Discourse Concerning the Being and Attributes of God, the Obligations of Natural Religion, and the Truth and Certainty of the Christian Revelation of 1713, the Anglican clergyman Samuel Clarke identified 4 strands of contemporary deist thought, which he felt needed urgently to be refuted. At its starkest, deism suggested that all could be known of the divine was that a creator must have existed, since the evidence of his creation was plain for all to see. Other deists were not quite so reductionist, arguing with Newton that this creator must continue to interfere occasionally in the universe, if only to keep the stars in their places, since not all aspects of the physical universe were capable of self-regulation. Still others argued that an all-powerful creator with no obvious motive to create a world could be deduced to be good, just, and merciful, as well as all-powerful, through his bountiful act of creation. The deists who came closest to a fully Christian position were those who believed that rationally defensible or natural religion could confirm the reality of good and evil, the existence of the soul, and the certainty of an afterlife. But even these writers, who were prepared to accept all that could be reasonably deduced of God, morality, and the supernatural through the natural channels of the intellect, fell well short of orthodox Christian belief by explicitly rejecting the evidence of revelation. It is all too easy to exaggerate the importance of the deists and to imagine that their extreme positions were characteristic of enlightened thought of the day, even that they anticipated the beliefs of a secular modern world. It would probably be closer to the truth to see most thinking people of the time as having felt intuitively that reason and revelation must be compatible, but as believing that stronger intellectual justifications were needed to prove Christianity or its essentials to be true beyond the possibility of doubt. It was not only extreme deists who struggled to reconcile inherited ideas about the Christian message with the self-imposed rigors of newly fashionable philosophical systems. The Anglican John Locke, for example, tried in The Reasonableness of Christianity as Delivered in the Scriptures, 1695, to show how much of Christianity could be ascertained by the use of natural reason. Locke stopped just short of deism by insisting that biblical miracles offered proof of the divine origin of the Scriptures, thus protecting the notion of supernatural evidence or revelation. John Toland's more radical Christianity Not Mysterious, 1696, agreed that God's existence and even the validity of his revelation could be rationally deduced, but argued that the traditional mysteries associated with Christianity had been introduced through pagan superstitions and priestly corruptions. Both works, which were seen by many Orthodox Christians as invitations to infidelity, were received with widespread horror when they were first published. But Locke's The Reasonableness of Christianity meant only to establish a basis for agreement among a majority of Christians, and even Toland's work, though certainly deist, seems, with hindsight, to have been closer in spirit to a piece of 17th century Protestant polemic than to a 19th century anti-religious tract. The supposed secularism of many 18th century thinkers seems to have been far more superficial than is often supposed. Beneath the gloss of rational objectivity, usually lay continued sectarian hostility, or else the dream of reestablishing unity of faith within the old borders of Christendom. Both seem more aptly described as legacies of the Reformation than as anticipations of modern forms of secularism. The unintended effect of a proliferation of rational defenses of theism and the first principles of Christianity was to present many thinking people with the uneasy sense that their intuitive belief in the truth of the Christian message and their habits of Christian worship needed somehow to be squared with recent currents in philosophical thinking. As one humorist put it, no one had doubted the existence of God until the Boyle lecturers undertook to prove it. Increasingly, aspects of traditional Christianity which could not be grasped immediately, or which did not seem to accord with common sense, began to seem dubious. Monks and nuns in Catholic countries began to be judged by human rather than by otherworldly standards. Their care of the sick and the poor, which clearly served a useful social purpose, seemed perfectly commendable. But the contemplative life, the notion of doing good both in this world and the next through prayer, began to seem like a self-indulgent delusion. Tales of corruption among the religious, of cruelty on the part of Catholic school teachers, of self-interest on the part of clergymen and particularly bishops, were no longer restricted to Protestant critiques of Catholicism, but became the standard fare of satires and exposés penned by philosophers, often themselves at least nominally Catholic, and even like Voltaire and Diderot, Jesuit educated. Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopede, 1751 through 65, the foremost piece of Enlightenment polemic undertaken by the philosophes, was riddled with anti-clerical sentiment. Even the definition of a term as apparently neutral as cowl, for example, offered an excuse for exposing absurdities within the Catholic Church. This item of religious clothing being dismissed as once the cause of a major war among the Franciscans. In a Protestant country like England, too, Edward Gibbon's authoritative The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 1776 through 88, portrayed early Christianity as an intolerant, superstitious, and barbarous fanaticism, which was largely to blame for the loss of the genuinely civilizing effects of the classical world so admired by both Protestant and Catholic philosophers. The more earnestly would-be defenders of rational religion and natural theology sought to prove their case, the more scandalously they viewed the actual practice of Christianity, whether in the absolutist regimes of their own day or in the remote Christian past. Mischievous contrasts were drawn with other cultures, the Tahitians, Persians, or Chinese being presented as morally superior to the Europeans, Islam being held up as a better civic religion than Christianity, or Confucianism as a more rational creed than Catholicism. In Germany, Gotthold Lessing's Nathan der Wise, 1779, presented a Jew as the archetypically tolerant, rational, and benevolent, enlightened man. Freemasonry, whose lodges offered reasonable forms of Christianity in England and Germany, or more frankly, anti-clerical deism in France and Italy, began to rise in membership. Everywhere, the philosophers' idealized notion of what rational people should believe and how they ought to behave came increasingly into tension with how Christianity was actually lived. In their high ideals, coupled with increasing intolerance of what they saw as the corruptions, superstitions, and idiocies of the unenlightened, the rhetoric of the philosophers took on many of the characteristics of those Christians whose reforming zeal had ushered in the Reformation of the 16th century. The Enlightenment of the 18th century was ultimately to prove as damaging to the restoration of Christian consensus as the Reformation had been instrumental in breaking it. This ends part 1.